Hello, good evening, everybody. I'm Nicola Ramsden. I'm the chairman of the BEARR Trust, and welcome to our summer lecture with David Nott and Bridget Kendall. We've organised this event to support the BEARR Trust's Ukraine emergency appeal and the incredibly valuable work of the David Nott Foundation. Thank you to everyone who has donated to this. We're dividing all donations equally between BEARR and the David Nott Foundation. It's still possible to donate, and you'll find a link to do that in the chat. I need to let you know that we are recording the event, and we'll send a link to the recording to everyone who registered. But if you can keep your video on, that would be welcome. We'd like to replicate the feel of being together in a lecture hall that we used to enjoy when we held our lectures in person. But please make sure that your microphone is muted. David and Bridget are happy to take questions after their discussion. We're a large audience this evening, so please would you type your questions into the chat while David and Bridget are speaking. We will select questions. We might even invite you to unmute and put your question in person, but if there's any problem with doing that, I can ask your question for you. However, we might not be able to take all questions. There are a lot of us, and we will finish the event promptly at 7:45. Now, a few quick words on the BEARR Trust's emergency Ukraine appeal. We launched our appeal within 3 days of the invasion of Ukraine, and the response has been extraordinary. To date, we have sent around £200,000 to our partners in Ukraine and Moldova, and our partners are mostly small voluntary associations and civil society organisations, and they have bought emergency supplies for refugees and for vulnerable people who are unable to leave their homes. These groups are under continuous and increasing pressure, and we aim to support them for as long as we can. Now, David Nott returned recently from Ukraine. He is one of the most experienced trauma surgeons in the world, and he and his colleagues have now trained dozens of Ukrainian doctors in trauma surgery. If you've read David's book, War Doctor, or heard any of his interviews, you will know that he has volunteered to work in zones of conflict and catastrophe around the world for many years. And this has exposed him to severe personal risk and also to degrees of lawlessness and inhumanity that I think few of us could even begin to imagine. David and his wife Ellie co-founded the David Nott Foundation in 2015, and they've now trained, I believe, around 1,000 doctors in the surgical techniques that David has developed in the most harrowing conditions. Now, Bridget Kendall, who we are honoured to have as a patron of the BEARR Trust, is the Master of Peterhouse College, Cambridge. She's well known as the BBC's former diplomatic correspondent from 1998 to 2016. And before that, she was Moscow correspondent for the BBC from 1998 to 1995. Bridget interviewed Vladimir Putin in the early 2000s. And in 2019, she gave the BEARR Trust annual lecture with the prescient title of Russia and the no-rules world of President Putin. So David and Bridget, we are very grateful to you for giving your time this evening. I know that your conversation is going to be fascinating, so thank you very much. And now over to you, Bridget.
Thank you very much, Nicola. And David, what a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to you. For my sake and for the sake of those watching who've not followed your work since you began, can we go back a bit and can I ask you how you got involved, first of all, in volunteering to work in combat zones as a surgeon?
Yeah, I think it goes back many years really, when I was a registrar in Manchester Royal Infirmary as a young surgeon. And my dad was from abroad, and he always wanted to work for the UN, and used to say, you know, if I had my time again, David, I'd work with the UN. And he sort of instilled in me lots of things about war, because he helped his family escape from Burma during the Second World War, and he told me sort of great stories about how they were pursued by the Japanese and so on and so forth. So I had a lot of sort of war instillment, really, I suppose, by him. And then he rang me up one day in the when I was a registrar and said, Dave, I need to take you to see a film called The Killing Fields. And The Killing Fields are the most amazing film about your mother and I went to see it, but you need to come and see it too. So I went to see it, and I couldn't speak at the end of it. It was just one of the most amazing films I'd ever seen. It was about journalism. It was about people helping each other. It was about a journalist really helping and save the lives of other journalists. It was about the inhumanity to man. It was about everything that suddenly the penny dropped in my head that I really wanted to work in this sort of environment. And I went home, and I then went back the following day and went to see it again. And at the end of the film, what struck me was where the two journalists met in Cambodia, which is under a sign of the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross. And I looked at that sign and I thought, right, that's what I want to do with my life. I want to work and be involved with abroad and work with the Red Cross and things like this. So, of course, I had to wait for a few years until I became a consultant. And as soon as I became a consultant, I got my job in Charing Cross. I was the senior registrar in Liverpool, and then applied to the BMJ, and I got this interview and somehow got the job. And within a few months of starting the job in October 1992, of course, the war in Bosnia started as well. And I was then transfixed really on the television, looking at what was going on in Bosnia. And then one day I saw a BBC report which showed a man looking for his daughter under some rubble, and he found his daughter and he rushed her to a hospital, and there was no doctors in the hospital to take care of his daughter. So that moment just made a huge impact on me. And the following day I contacted Médecins Sans Frontières and I said, look, will you take me? And then the following day they said, yes, we will. And can you go tomorrow? And so I went to see my boss, and he said, no, you can't go. And I said, well, I'm sorry, I've got to go. He said, well, if you go, then there won't be a job for you when I come back. So, well, I said, too bad, I'm going. So it was just something inside me that made me want to work abroad. And it was just the most amazing experience to work in Sarajevo with the war happening, and tracer bullets flying around, and looking out this little window in my operating theatre, and to see, I suppose it was the endorphins of war. I'd never felt so elated in my whole life. And then when it was the danger, it was the excitement, it was being able to treat patients that were coming in who were very war wounded, and being able to help them as well when they had no help otherwise. It was just the most amazing thing I felt. And I thought to myself, well, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life.
And so you have. Because it's been quite a lot of conflicts, hasn't it?
So I have, yes.
What came after Bosnia?
So after Bosnia, I went off to Kabul, and I was in Kabul when the Mujahideen were having a civil war, and the Taliban came into Kabul that time in 1996. And I then stayed, and I did civil wars, Sierra Leone, Liberia. I went off to, after that, Ivory Coast. I went to most wars in Africa after that, really, working for various aid agencies. And in fact, I'd done 27 war missions until to date, really. Sometimes I've been back to the same place 3 or 4 times, like in Syria, for example, and continued making friends and continued working hard, really, and developing a lot of skills. And that's the reason why Ellie and I set the foundation up.
Is this the Ukraine war? Is this the first war that's on the territory of the former Soviet Union for you?
It is indeed, yes, it is indeed. And I think, sorry, Bridget.
No, I was just wondering because these are different parts of the world with different challenges. You've been in Yemen too, haven't you, as well, which is a conflict which I think quite a lot of us feel uncomfortable that we're so focused on Ukraine, and then you think about Yemen and think how terrible the situation is there. But we can maybe talk about that. But I was thinking about how different the situation. I mean, on the one hand, you might say in wars it's the same. You know, people get weapons, attack people, they get wounded. You need to help them. But I imagine every war is different because you have different levels of expertise locally that you can tap into, different challenges, whether it's clean water or heat or I don't know. I want, how different are they?
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's very interesting, really. I mean, war is it depends on what patients are suffering from, and most wars produce blast injuries, they produce fragmentation injuries, they produce high velocity gunshot wounds, low velocity gunshot wounds. They produce injuries to patients that require expertise really in trying to get them through their operations. But of course, on top of that, you've got the dangers outside the hospital. You're either right on the front line where we were in Aleppo in Syria, where you can hear gun shooting and shooting outside. The hospitals at that time were being bombed. You could feel the shock waves of bombs being dropped and so on and so forth. And of course, then you had the problems with where you were, how deep inside a situation you were, and how deep inside you were to try and get out. Can you get out? Are the roads blocked? Things like this. Are the dangers to your own personal life? And of course, the people that you work with as well, they don't know really who you are. And you have to develop really intense relationships with the people that you work with, because, you're trying to be friends with them. You're trying to be humble. You're trying to be diplomatic. You're trying to say, well, actually, a lot of people turn around and say, well, what are you doing here? Why do you come? Well, I've come to help you. Well, that's bizarre. Why would you want to come all this way to help me? And it's one of those things that's quite difficult to explain to somebody that, I'm here to help you. I'm here to try and pass on my experience to you if you really want to accept it. And of course, some people don't want to accept it, and you accept that rule. But after a while, you embed yourselves into the whole fragility of the situation that you are in, and you're able to really develop significant partnerships with everybody you meet, not just the doctors, but the nurses and the people, the managers of the hospital. You're able to talk to them. You're able to somehow take some time, but it takes a long time to, really it takes 3 to 4 weeks of staying in one hospital to really embed yourself, and for them to know that you can help them and you can offer them some hope and help really as well.
Let's come on to Ukraine now, because you've had 2 trips there, haven't you?
Yes.
Was the first one in early April, first 2 weeks of April, and then just got back a week ago from the second one, right?
Yes. And I think what happened to me was that I'd been in Syria in 2016 when I was involved in helping lots of my Syrian colleagues try and escape from the Russian bombardment. And the Russian bombardment, people forget really how awful it really was. They were using bunker busting bombs, which were able to explode underground. So the bomb exploded on the street, and then it burrowed itself about 10 feet into the ground and then re-exploded again. So people that were in underground hospitals, that were in underground basements, were being blown apart by these horrendous bombs, and shells were landing all around the place. And it seemed to me that there was a complete lack of humanity, complete lack of civilized culture, really, of the people that were doing this. Did they not really understand how they were affecting these poor civilians on the ground? And that always affected me, really. And I went back to Aleppo and saw the devastation that was caused. And it was, I didn't go to Chechnya. I had the opportunity to go, but I didn't go. And, Grozny was like Aleppo, I'm sure, at that time. And then, of course, I saw what was happening. And all of a sudden, I thought, no, the whole thing is going to happen again. Ukraine is going to be under the thumb of the Russian regime again. They're going to use the same tactics, and I just felt my heart went out to Ukraine in one respect. So I contacted. I didn't know anybody in Ukraine. I didn't know anybody at all about Ukrainian doctors. I'd never been to Ukraine. I'd never known anything about the situation. But what I did know was that the experience that I had of the indiscriminate bombing of and shelling of what the Russians potentially could probably do, and so the only person I knew that had been to Ukraine was one of the neurosurgeons, Henry Marsh. And Henry Marsh had written 2 fantastic books and how he'd been into the Ukraine and how he'd helped the doctors there. So I contacted him and I said, Henry, can you help me? Because I would really like to help the Ukrainian doctors. I don't know who they are, where they are. And so he came back to me almost immediately and said, well, David, how are you going to do this? And I said, well, we have a foundation and I train doctors abroad, and I'm quite willing to just sit down and go through some training with them. So him and I sat down for 12 hours, 4 days after the war started, and we had 576 doctors on the Zoom session with us, and we were just discussing what's going to happen. You're going to be bombed, you're going to have mass casualties. Have you ever dealt with mass casualties? The answer was no, we haven't dealt with mass casualties. So then it was a matter of going through how you're going to deal with this, how you're going to deal with all the casualties that you have. And then after doing that for a while, I had lots of conversations with lots of doctors who then sent me their patients and said, David, we actually haven't seen this sort of devastation, and we haven't seen the damage that patients have had. Would you like to help us more? So with that, I contacted another aid agency who I knew had been working on the ground called OSAM. And OSAM are a union of medical charities, which I worked with when I was in Syria. So I contacted them and said, look, some of the doctors would like me to go to Ukraine and work with them. Would you help me? So on the 2nd of April, I went to the Ukraine on my own with OSAM and spent a fantastic 2 weeks operating with the doctors on lots and lots of war-injured patients and advising them on how to close the war wounds, how to examine patients properly, what exactly to do, and so on. And again, just giving my experience of how to manage it. And my second, if I could just go on for a second or two, my second visit was I'd just come back a week or so ago. And because the foundation, we run a charity, the David Nott Foundation, we go out and train doctors all around the world using courses. And with our course, the Hostile Environment Surgical Training course, we went off to Dnipro and we trained 36 doctors in Dnipro over 3 days, an intensive course on war injuries and how they can manage them and so on. And then we went off to Kharkiv for a further 3 days and again trained another 30 or so doctors on those techniques too. But the doctors in Dnipro, a lot of them had come up from the Donbass, had come up from Donetsk and so on and so forth. And a lot of them really wanted to have, I think, probably an experienced war surgeon tell them that they were doing the right things. And I think a lot of it is to do with building confidence. A lot of it is to instill, that they are doing the right thing, carry on because it's great what you're doing. And if I could advise you, perhaps change this way of managing it slightly, then, carry on. And so it was the most amazing course. I came back a week or so ago from that.
So lots of questions. Did you need a translator, or did you find lots of people spoke English in Ukraine?
No. So about 15% of the doctors speak English, the rest don't. And when we were in one of the places where I worked with in April, there was a doctor who became a really great friend during that time. And he was amazing. And he said, well, David, I will come with you and I'll translate for you. And he was just amazing. So he came with us for the 3 days, and every word I spoke, he translated into Ukraine, and he sat there all the way through, and he translated everything. And I think the reason why he did that was because we'd built up this huge relationship, him and I, when I'd gone to Ukraine. There's a town that I worked in with him just south of Kyiv, who had received lots of war wounded. And again, it's building this trust, it's building this sort of friendship, it's building this sort of amazing sort of discovery of things that he wanted to know, and I could teach him, and he became my friend, and then he wanted to pay back. So he came and was fantastic to be able to translate for us.
And of course, for you, you need a translator who's really a surgeon, don't you? Because you've got to be able to explain the right words. So you need someone who's probably done some work abroad and has the vocabulary in both languages.
Well, exactly. And you need somebody that understands medicine, and you need somebody and he was a surgeon, and so he understood exactly what I'm saying. I mean, one of the biggest problems of going abroad is not speaking the language. And of course, when you're discussing a case, or when you're presenting a patient or presenting something, and you have a translator that doesn't really understand the medical language, then you have somebody standing next to you, and you talk to that person who translates, but he translates something that's completely opposite to what you're saying. So he then tells the audience something completely opposite to what you want to say, and they look at you sort of stunned, and you wonder, well, why are they looking at me so stunned? It's because he hasn't translated what you're translating.
So that's happened in other places, has it?
A lot of the time, and it's very, very difficult. And of course, my biggest problem, I think, in life is languages. And although I speak Welsh, it doesn't get you very far in Kharkiv. And French is I spoke French when I was in Cameroon, and I was able to get the message across there. But it's a very big problem, Arabic and Spanish and these languages. If you can speak them, it would be fantastic. One of the things, if I ever came back in life again, I would like to be a linguistic person.
I often think we need that. Do you remember in early Star Trek, they used to, when they landed on a new planet, they'd have a special gizmo, and you sort of turn it on and it translates everything. Actually, Google Translate does a lot for basic things, but if you're talking about the subtleties of surgery, that's rather different. Although at least I suppose it's a part of medicine where you can sort of show and tell a bit.
Yes, I mean, I think Google Translate is great. I mean, you can talk into it and you can, decipher. But while I'm waiting for somebody to develop a translating machine that you just talk into it and it'll just tell the patient, tell the people.
I expect it'll come, so especially if it's technical language.
Yeah.
But of course, part of what you're doing is not just about technical stuff. It's also about empathy, and you must be dealing with people who are. Well, there are two things, aren't there? There's the trauma of seeing the horrific, catastrophic wounds and knowing what's happening to your country. And then, as you said, there's also the danger of thinking, was something going to land on this hospital and blow us all up? And I suppose part of what you have to do is not just build their confidence, but also somehow help them psychologically in some way.
Well, you can. And I think that's the beauty of how it's developed, really, how the foundation has developed, because I can go there, and there's a few of us now that have been in the same situation, and I can tell them, I know what you're suffering from, I know what's happening to you, I know that you have never seen such terrible injuries. I mean, there was sometimes when, certainly in Aleppo, when I was there in 2014, when the barrel bombs were being dropped and families were coming in, and some dreadful scenes of children having been, and those still stay with me, those images, and they're terrible, terrible images. But for me to have done it for say 20 years and then still be affected by what I saw, must mean something. And again, if you're a young doctor, and for the first, you expect your life to be as training as a surgeon, to go under the wing of a senior surgeon, to be shown how to manage, the elective cases. Somebody's got to, needs their gallbladder taking out because they've got gallstones, and it's a very nice operation to do. Everything's fine. You see the patient afterwards, and everything's wonderful, and they go home. That's what you expect surgery to be, an elective type procedure that's all happy and everything goes well, you look after your patients. But when you see man's destructive nature up against another man with arms and limbs, I don't want to say too much because it's horrible. It really is horrible. And then when you're a young surgeon or a young doctor and you're in a hospital which is and you've been in that hospital, or you've gone to that hospital to try and help people, and you see the worst things possible, it has a huge impact. And that's, I think, the problem with Ukraine, is that the doctors have not seen these sort of injuries before. I mean, some of the injuries that they are seeing are absolutely horrendous. And to actually see and be in the emergency department when these sort of injuries occur has a massive effect on the doctors. And I can go there with my team and I can say, I know what you're feeling. I know what you're seeing in your head when you're going to sleep. I know those visions that you're seeing. I've been there. I've sat there. I know what it's like to have PTSD. I know what it's like to have, these terrible, visions. And I know what it's like for you to have to go back to that hospital again. But I'm here to try and have empathy with you. I'm here to try and help you deal with those sort of injuries. And a lot of the doctors are still sending me messages and saying, these are the patients that I'm dealing with. What do you think about this? And we're getting to a level now where it's a matter of, okay, let's try our best to try and help you deal with this patient as best as I possibly can.
Presumably, over the years that you've been doing this, I mean, if you go back to 1992, I mean, there wasn't even the need of the internet, it's hard to believe, isn't it? But now with and then there were rather crude mobile phones, and now we have really quite sophisticated iPhones, Zooms, Skype and things. There must be a lot more that you can do virtually than you could to begin with.
There's a huge amount. I mean, a lot of the discussions I have about patients are over WhatsApp or Telegram or the other Viber, things like this, which I get sent pictures, and I've got this patient. What do you think I should do about this patient? I mean, I've actually directed operations using Skype and helping doctors through procedures, which to try and help their patients and so on. But I've always said, I think really it doesn't. I could sit at home. I could do a Zoom. I could just sit there and say, okay, well, let me advise you about what to do. But to actually go there, to actually, them seeing that you've made this huge sacrifice almost of leaving your home, coming tens of thousands of miles, and then being in a car and drive 20 hours from Warsaw to Kharkiv, and then to operate with you in your hospital in Kharkiv, to me, it just shows that people do care, and we are with you really on this. And I think that's not only that, you can show people, on a model how to do an operation, and you can actually transpose that model to, their procedure. But to actually be in the operating theatre and to actually help them with an operation is the most amazing thing you can possibly do. And there are people do lots of advice and consultations on Zoom, but to actually sit there with them and hold their hand, it's just fantastic.
And you so with your foundation, do you now have a team of doctors who do this, or is it very much you doing it?
It was me right at the very beginning, but we've trained lots and lots of doctors. So what happens is that my sort of 30 years of knowledge has been distilled into this course, which lasts 5 days. And what we do, we run a train the trainers course, and we train up doctors so that they can understand what's going in my head and how I'm trying to train other doctors. But what we really want to do with the foundation is actually not just for me to train doctors from the UK to go out and give this course, but what we're trying to do is train local doctors. So we train local doctors so that they can then locally give our course, and then somebody from our foundation will sit with them while they run a course, so they can do it in their own language. They can talk to their own people in their own language, and they can discuss things, and they can come back to me if necessary. So our vision now with the foundation is to actually be able to run a course locally, and for those local surgeons to take that course and to give it wherever they are. So at the moment, we're in discussions with the Ukrainian Ministry of Health to try and train, do a trainer's course. So the 30 years of knowledge that I've got can be given in Ukraine and can be given to doctors in Ukraine. And not only that, we have lots and lots of simulation. We have this most amazing mannequin called Heston, who has all the operations on him. He's called Heston because we run this hostile environment surgical training course, HEST. So we called him Heston, and he has all the operations which you need to know about as a surgeon. You can get your hands in, you can get your hands in his tummy and his chest and his legs and arms. And so we're going to create this Heston and give it to the Ukrainian surgeons so they can run the course with Heston, plus all our equipment that we take with it. We take massive amounts of equipment with us so they can stitch, and we try and make it as realistic as possible. And then they run their own course in their own language. And then we bring our equipment, or certainly Heston, back to the UK, where he can then go out again with another local group of surgeons. And that's our plan.
Because I was reading he's worth tens of thousands of pounds, right? It's not Heston's like you can have lots of Hestons.
Well, that's right, but Heston's worth hundreds of thousands of pounds.
Hundreds of thousands, yeah.
And of course the issue is that it's taken 4 years to develop Heston, and we're on the plans of doing Heston 2 and Heston 3. It's going to take us time, but I think on the other hand, the money that we have through our foundation, through donations, is all spent on developing our models, is making the simulation as realistic as possible, is developing new Hestons, and that's what the money is used for. And so we don't care really. We're very proud to spend time to create new models.
A question about equipment, because I've been wondering about this. You said you took masses of equipment out with you. Do the hospitals in places like Dnipro or wherever you were, Kharkiv, do they have what they need, or are they short of staff? Are they short of? Do you arrive and find that you've bought quite a lot of something, but actually it's not enough, or there's other things that you didn't know they were lacking, or are they actually quite well stocked?
To a certain degree, they're well stocked. Some other parts they don't have. For example, when we went I had an operation to do in Kharkiv General Hospital, and they didn't have the equipment to take a split skin graft to cover a war wound. So we had a couple of split skin graft knives with us. So the foundation left the knives with them so that they can be sterilized and they can be used. So we use those knives to cover various war wounds on some of their patients in Kharkiv. And what we do as well is that I ask the surgeons in Dnipro and in Kharkiv, what is it you want? What equipment do you need? And they're in touch with me to ask, we need more skin graft equipment. We need lots of these equipment. So yes, and we try then. And there are lots of fantastic organizations in the UK that I try and give, that's their role, is to try and get as much equipment out to Ukraine as they possibly can. So we just pass that knowledge on, or the request onto those groups of people, and they then try and get the equipment to them.
And how does it compare, the state of the hospitals in the places you've been in Ukraine, to what you saw in Yemen or Aleppo, in terms of equipment and things like that?
Okay, so I think they're better stocked in Ukraine than they are in Yemen, or certainly Syria. I mean, a lot of difficulty in getting the equipment to those places was it's very difficult to get equipment, and of course, lots of general materials like chest drains and chest bottles and anesthetic equipment and drugs and things run out very rapidly when you're in a full-blown war, and you need lots of equipment coming in all the time. It seems to me that at the moment Ukraine are quite well stocked as regards getting stuff from the West across the borders into their hospitals. I think the big issue is that the hospitals in the East are having difficulty because the distances are so long to get their equipment to them, and they're running out of stocks quite rapidly. That first aid equipment is really what's required. Lots of swabs and lots of bandages and lots of infusion sets and so on to manage their patients on the front line, where they're really having a hard time at the moment.
It really is a lot of it about geography, isn't it? I was thinking, I was down on the Chechen border in the Second Chechen War, and there is a border with Georgia, but it's in the mountains. It's not easy. So there, they were very short of equipment. They didn't even have, in the refugee camps, didn't even sometimes have aspirin. And the problem is, unlike in Ukraine, there's not a transit route out, which at the moment Ukraine has that, but of course not in some places in the Donbass. So yes, it makes you think. But I was thinking also, in all the places you've been in Africa, there must have been other challenges too.
Always, yes. There's always challenges in getting equipment and having the right equipment and having the right drugs and having, you know, lots of pain relieving drugs. The most important thing is pain relief in post-operative management. And sometimes, you know, you don't have you just have some paracetamol or something like that. You don't have the opiates that are required on some people with significant severe pain. So it's a huge challenge. And every time I come back, you know, I give lists and discuss it with various people. How can we get more, you know, equipment out to them? And hospitals everywhere require equipment. They require, you know, and the more equipment that they have, it doesn't matter if it's stockpiled, it doesn't matter, because that one day they may suffer from mass casualties, they may use all that equipment and so on. So it's a challenge everywhere. It's a challenge everywhere. It's a challenge in Ukraine, it's a challenge in the Congo, it's a challenge everywhere.
A question about you, if I may. So you're an NHS consultant at St Mary's in London. Do you have much time to go back to that? I mean, but also, how do you psychologically adjust when you do?
Well, I'll give you an example. I came back from Kharkiv on Sunday, last Sunday, yeah. And I came back at 7 o'clock in the evening and hadn't seen the family at all for 10 days or so. And it was a joy to see them for an hour before the ladies went to bed. The little girls, I call them the ladies, went to bed. And so a few hours with my wife. And then at 7 o'clock the following morning, I had a phone call saying, David, you need to come to St Mary's now, because there's a patient that requires your, you know, so there I am pedaling on my bicycle then up the road to St Mary's. And I was there basically for the whole week. So I try and give as much back to the NHS as I possibly can. And, you know, I know it sounds corny to say, but, you know, I really enjoy my job. It's a very strange thing. Sometimes when I'm walking around St Mary's, I think, God, this is a great job. And then when I'm walking around, you know, Kharkiv, wow, this is a great job. And, you know, I don't know where the enthusiasm comes from, but it's constantly there. And I enjoy what I do. And that's it.
It's a real pleasure to talk to you about it. I know there are loads of questions. I'm going to hand over to Nicola, because she's been looking at some of the questions that are coming in. So she can put some of them to you or direct them in your direction.
Thank you very much. There certainly have been some very interesting questions here. Not surprisingly, David, you are quite clearly an inspiration to other people in your profession. And quite a few of the questions, which I'll start with, are really asking advice for how to follow in your footsteps. Now, one of them, let me just read this one out. This was the first question. And I will apologize to Reinelt in advance, because I suspect I'm pronouncing your name wrongly. And I certainly can't manage the Welsh greeting that you very properly used for David. But Reinald Morgan's question was, what would be the best way to gain experience in humanitarian surgery as a core surgical trainee? And other people too, Camilla has asked, what would be your advice for a junior doctor building up a portfolio of experience?
Well, that's a great question to ask. I mean, I think what you have to do really is work out what you want to do with your life as an NHS doctor, because the majority of your life will be as an NHS doctor. So I think that what I do is my job is to be a general surgeon, a vascular surgeon, a trauma surgeon. I do cancer work at the Royal Marsden. And so that's what I like to do. And then the humanitarian surgery is something that's like a hobby and a passion. And that candle burns all the time. But my real job is working in the NHS. My real job is spending 90% of my time in the NHS doing a proper consultant job, having a staff that I work with, and so on and so forth. So you have to decide to what sort of job that you want to do. And if you want to, and then go down that path until you become a consultant. And there's very little you can do at the moment, because you need a lot of experience to go out to war zones or to go out and do a humanitarian job. You really need to have that backup support of understanding how to do surgery, how your hands work, and what job you do, because when you come back, that's the job you're going to be doing. And the passion of humanitarian surgery is something that you just keep on the back burner. And once you become a consultant, go out and do a course, go out and do a mission with one of the aid agencies, and just see how you like it. It's unfortunate that many of the surgeons that I have met throughout my life that have done NGO work have only done 1 or 2 missions. It's just not for them. To be sitting in a dark room in Chad with the lights, the candle burning, and then put the candle out, and then all of a sudden you've got your tent around you, and you're lying on the floor in a mattress, and you've got the sort of mosquito net, and then all of a sudden you hear this scuttle, 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 and then you put your torch on and you shine your light, and there's all these bugs coming towards you. It's something that people want to run away from, but it's just like, whoa. For me, that was just, wow, that was an amazing, after dinner story, so to speak, really. But that's, it's those things like that you really want to enjoy both the difficulty of it all, the most, it's very difficult to get from place to place. And it's hard work. And, I was in Nepal in the earthquakes, and, to see these landslides coming down, you're sitting in a car, and there's below you look down on the left-hand side, there's a drop of about 200 feet, and there's some bloke driving the car, and you're thinking, oh my goodness, I hope he stays on the road. It's all these sort of things that make up this humanitarian response. It's not just the surgery, it's the fun, it's the enjoyment, it's the adventure, it's all this sort of stuff.
Thank you, David. There are a couple of questions that were somewhat related to that, actually. Camille also asked, what is the scope for doctors now to become proficient in multiple surgical disciplines? And in fact, I remember reading in your book how you had to learn how to do a C-section in some terrible circumstances, and plastic surgery as well. And perhaps a question that takes that a little bit further, Olivia Boutel asked whether, other than surgery, which medical specialisms are most applicable in the war environment for humanitarian aid?
Well, I'll answer that question first, actually. I mean, an anaesthetist is a perfect example. To be an anaesthetist in a war zone is great. To be a physician looking after, because the things happen in war zones are not just war injuries. The diabetes, the heart disease, the cancers, all this sort of stuff go on, and that's why healthcare is so important in an environment, because and that's why I have this other thing as well, which I told Bridget the other day, that healthcare is so important, and healthcare workers are targeted, hospitals are targeted, and the reason why they're targeted is because it psychologically tortures the clientele or the civilian population around them. Because if you've got a hospital and you know that you've got a place of sanctuary, and you know that if you're wounded you can go there and somebody will look after you, that is a wonderful thing to have. But if that hospital is targeted, then that's always known as a war crime. But throughout the decades that I've been working, nobody has ever been taken to court over that. And it's one of the most repulsive, repugnant unhumanitarian acts you can actually do, is to target a hospital and target doctors. So I always fly the flag about that, really. But again, you know, all doctors are required, physicians, surgeons, anaesthetists. You know, there's a calling for all sorts of doctors in war zones.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned war crimes, and I know that my colleague Janet Gunn actually has a question about that, and I wonder whether, Janet, would you like to unmute yourself and ask David that question?
Thanks, David. This is absolutely fascinating, and we have got onto the subject of war crimes. So I wondered whether, given that a lot of Ukrainian lawyers and international lawyers and prosecutors and all sorts of people are taking forensic evidence all over areas that have been attacked in Ukraine, I wondered whether you knew whether surgeons like yourself and other medical professionals are giving evidence to these lawyers which could be used in war crimes prosecutions.
Well, I haven't had that much, I'll be totally honest with you, I haven't had that much experience in Ukraine at the moment of the perpetrators of problems like this. But I have in Syria. In 2013, 14, 16, when hospitals were actively targeted, I mean, there were over 900 healthcare workers killed. And hospitals were actively targeted. There were people there that were targeted. But the big problem is certainly if you look at Ukraine, is the UN. I think Bridget will probably know a bit more about this than I do. But, Russia is on the UN Security Council, and therefore to get a war crime conviction, it has to go to The Hague. And The Hague now is heavily involved in the UN and heavily involved in the UN Security Council. So Russia, unless they agree to, unless they agree to realize that they have caused war crimes, very little will happen to, the hierarchy of the Russian presidency, I think. I don't know. What do you think about that, Bridget?
Yes, no, I think it is a problem with the UN Security Council because Russia has a veto power. And beyond that, the way Mr. Putin looks at the world, he sees the glass half full, that over half the world's population live in countries where, when it came to some of the crucial votes at the UN, they didn't vote against Russia. They either abstained or they voted with it. A few voted with it, many abstained. So I think he feels quite empowered. He thinks this is the West's war on Russia and not the world's war on Russia. They can still sell their oil and gas wherever and so on. So that it's not just a UN Security Council problem, it's a sort of broader problem of he doesn't feel Russia's a pariah state. And that will continue to make him feel that he has a just cause, if you like, or an argument that he can make where people feel there's, it's not just Russia doing something unbelievable and brutal with no just cause. He thinks there are quite a lot of countries in the world who think, NATO was provoking Russia, if you like, or Ukraine through being trained by NATO. So I think it's very complicated. So in practically speaking, calling these people to account or calling governments to account will only happen when something changes at the top in Russia. So it's always at the moment very important to keep watching very, very closely what's happening in Moscow, what changes are happening in the military, what glimmers we get of unease at the top, how Mr. Putin is, how the war's going. So, yeah, I don't think there's unfortunately, a clear path towards making sure that people, or those who are taking the decisions about this war, are held to account at the moment.
Mm.
Well, they were not taken into account in Syria either, and a lot of perpetrations of war happened there, and nothing has happened. Nothing has happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think, I mean, that may well answer another question that was asked by Sofs. She asked, given your experience, David, what you believe the barriers to adequate accountability for breaches of international humanitarian law are, and how these might be addressed. And we've just sort of talked about it on a more geopolitical level, but is there any more you could add from your own experience that you think might help?
Well, gosh, when I was angry, very, very angry in Syria, very, very angry. And I would come back with these pictures of the most awful injuries to children. And I remember going back, and I remember coming back to go to the Houses of Parliament. And I basically walked into the Houses of Parliament in that place, Portcullis House. I went into Portcullis House and I said, look, I'm here. My name is Dr. Nott, and I want to show as many MPs what's happening there at the moment. And I just want you to see what's happening. And this is what happened. I went and spoke to a very senior MP, who then started crying in his room. And I didn't want him to cry looking at these pictures. I wanted him to do something. And he didn't do anything. So I said, well, do something. What can you do? Well, I'm not sure what I can do, David, but you just need to, So I then went on to see another I went to see another MP, I went to see another MP, I went to see loads of people, and I said, look, do something. What can you do to stop the perpetrations of, well, I think just if you collect all the data you can, David, then perhaps, that's probably the right thing to do. So that's all I've done throughout my life, is collecting data and going and banging on the door of people and say, look, this is what I've got. This is the pictures of, here I am with this child. I'm standing next to this child. Here is the picture of me and this child that's done nothing. It's a civilian case. What are you going to do about it? And to this date, so on, not one person has done anything about it. And I don't know. I just bang my head against a brick wall. I haven't got anywhere. Nobody's taken any of my, anger to task at all. So, but I still do it. I mean, I still, take, sometimes difficult to take pictures when you're in war zones. You're looked on as like a tourist, almost a sort of war tourist. But it's important to document what's happened, and it's important to document hospitals that have been blown up. There's a hospital in Donetsk, which is one of my colleagues sent me a picture of, which has been blown up. You can see the actual hole in the hospital, and you can see, that shouldn't have happened. And then people would just say, oh, well, it's just collateral damage, or they'll say, well, actually, there were some terrorists inside the hospital, and therefore it was a legitimate target. But it's not true. None of these things are true. But, how on earth can you get a lawyer to work out that that there were no people in that hospital? You can't. And so it's very difficult to bring people to task. You can just keep banging the drum and being angry.
Yeah, indeed.
I mean, things do change. Think about Milosevic. He ended up, in the end, being put on trial. But sometimes you need a political change to make these things happen. But it's not, I don't think it's useless to collect the data and to make the case for that moment when it then becomes possible.
Well, I have I have all the data from the Syrian crisis. I've got all the stuff, that, and if anybody ever wants to, certainly, if somebody ever wanted to use that data from on a legal high, court case, I'm very happy to give them all that information, which I've said many times before.
Okay, thank you, David. And another aspect of politics, slightly different. A couple of questions here have touched on the question of the politics of health. There are two questions I'll just mention. One of them was the helping doctors to leave war zones, with reference to Syria, helping your colleagues to leave. And another one, looking at it from the other way round, this is from Catherine Campos, who asks, what are the key considerations for strengthening locally informed humanitarian surgical response programs and improving collaboration between local and global organizations who are operating in armed conflict zones?
Well, helping doctors to leave. So helping doctors to leave, you want to keep your doctors there at all times. You don't want the doctors to leave if you possibly can. But if they're trying to escape from being, if they're trying to escape from being killed, and you know that there is only one way out, you've got to help those doctors leave, because there's no point in having doctors that can't help patients. And if you know that they're going to be, destroyed, then you've got to help them leave. But most of the time, the most important thing is to keep the doctors in the right place in the hospitals where they are, so they can manage their cases. And at the moment in Ukraine, nobody is allowed to leave. No man under the age of 60 is allowed to leave the country, which means that all the doctors are still there. They're all working in the hospitals, and they're doing a great job. They're doing a fantastic job. And so what you're trying to do is to, I think, as we touched on before, as regards international communications between logistics and looking at WhatsApps and social media, is a way of getting information out from their hospitals. And so, the collaboration that we have, certainly with the foundation and all local doctors, wherever it is around the world, we keep in touch, and we have this twice monthly webinar series whereby doctors from all over the world who we've actually been to teach and train and make friends with, and are able then to have this twice monthly webinar meeting with us, where they can discuss their cases. Like a surgeon in the Congo can discuss a case with a surgeon in the Ukraine, who can discuss a case with a surgeon in America, and so on and so forth. So we act as a sort of hub for doctors from all the way around the world to discuss their cases. And that's how it gets out globally. That's the collaboration that the doctors in Ukraine will have with other doctors, and it works extremely well.
Thank you. David, there have been a couple of questions on mental health. One of them is, what is being done about mental health? And this is actually something we're seeing a lot now with the BEARR Trust, as well as sending emergency aid. We're increasingly being asked to fund psychologists to help people who have been traumatized. So that was one question, mental health provision. But also a question, how do you cope with it yourself, with the horrific things that you see? So
it's a really great thing that the BEARR Trust is doing to support psychologists to go out and help the doctors or anybody, civilians that are involved in this sort of conflict, because the amount of PTSD is enormous, and we don't realize how intense the mental health aspects of everybody involved in this war will be. Everybody needs psychological support, and it's a brilliant thing you're doing. I mean, the doctors that were coming up from Donetsk and the Donbass when we were in Dnipro a couple of weeks ago, they were seriously stressed. They were seriously stressed. I mean, you could tell that they weren't normal. That, well, of course they are normal, but you can tell that they were very stressed out. And those people do need support. Everybody needs support, from the general right down to the private. Everybody needs support, and the doctors all need support. Everybody does. So it's a huge, necessity to get mental health support. That's without a doubt. So how did I cope with my own mental health support? Well, badly, I would say, badly. And many times I would come back from a mission, and I knew that I was not quite right in the head for 3 months or so. It took me a while to get over many of the missions that I did. It took me, I needed, one time I when I came back from Syria in 2014, I had completely lost the plot, and my poor wife had to put up with a dreadful amount of madness, to be really honest with you. Madness to the degree that, I would lie on the floor in the fetal position. I would think that she was my jailer and all this sort of madness. And I knew for a fact that, I knew for a fact that I was not well, but I couldn't do anything about it. I could not do anything about this feeling of despair and everything else that went with it. And I knew that I wasn't right. But anyway, until my wife then took me to see, I'll be honest with you, a psychiatrist, and who helped me through this awful problem. But to be honest with you, you don't really realize, nobody in these war zones and actually realizes what their mental health is like, because you think that you're okay. You think, okay, well, I can't sleep very well at night time, but you don't realize that your personality is actually changing, and you're changing into something that is not nice, that you're arguing with people, you're just not a nice person, and your personality actually changes. And you need somebody to really bring you back on track and to advise you where to go to get help for this, because you don't know. You know there's something not quite right, but you don't know really how horrible you actually are.
Mm. Mm.
So you're doing a good job, the BEARR Trust.
Thank you, but that's a very salutary comment. I think we do have time for a couple more questions which relate more to the methods that you use. I just wanted to ask you a question that Dom has put, referring to what you say in your book about the staged treatment of wounded patients, where the body is allowed time to heal between operations, rather than treating absolutely everything caused by rather than treating absolutely everything. And this is a way of dealing with the trauma caused by the surgery itself. And he wondered whether you could say a little bit more about that approach.
So I'm not quite sure where the question's getting to, really, but if you've got, I think it probably relates to a mass casualty event, which happens all the time. In war, you get 100 patients brought in most of the time. And you have to deal with mass casualties, and mass casualties are something, again, you need to be trained at. You need to understand what provisions you have and how to then sort out the patients that are not going to make it, whilst those that are walking wounded, and then those that are really need treatment immediately. And it takes quite a bit of skill to be able to decipher amongst those sort of patients who you can treat immediately and who you can wait for an hour or 2 and 3 and so on and so forth. So that is, I think, a mass casualty type picture, which involves triage. And again, triage is something that we try and teach on all our courses. So one of the things that we teach is say, okay, you've got, and we have this virtual reality headset that they put on their heads, and it takes them into a mass casualty area where they press the right buttons to say, well, what do you think that patient, does he need surgery straight away, or does that one need surgery straight away? Can you leave that one to for a few hours, or does this one need to have your operation immediately? So that's how we teach that sort of stage procedure, I think, which is what the gentleman's getting at.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And there's a question here that I must put to you. It's in the chat, but it was kind of going through my mind as well. Is it problematic that Heston is a male body?
Well, he's not actually. He's sort of like half and half, actually, to be honest. He's got no bits down below, so to speak, really. And we can put bits into him that make him into a lady, and bits that make him into a gentleman. Right. But Heston is right. He's a man, and he's a he's going to be, Heston 2 is going to be slightly different to Heston 1. I won't tell you exactly how it is, but he's going to be significantly different. Right,
so we watch this space for Heston too. Okay, Bridget, I wondered whether you had any further questions that you would like to put to David as a result of what he's been saying.
I wanted to ask a question about you again. You know, we were talking about helping doctors leave, And have there been occasions, maybe this happened in Aleppo, where you thought, I better go now because I'm not much use to anyone if I don't survive? And then you have your wife and your little ladies. Or do you think, no, I should stay because I can do one more operation? I mean, these are really difficult calls. I don't know if you were able to share it with us.
Well, my life has changed without a doubt. I think it relates to the fact I was in Gaza in 2014, and there was a little girl that came in who'd been very badly damaged by fragmentation injuries, and she went on the operating table. And I was in one of the big hospitals in Gaza City, and she was dying. This poor, she was only 7, and I walked into the operating room, and I took the role of being a pediatric surgeon when I was in Gaza, because I'd done quite a bit of pediatrics, and the people realized that, I could operate on children. So I took that sort of role in Gaza City, and I went into the operating theatre, and she was on the operating table, and the anaesthetist had anaesthetized her, and then suddenly came in, and suddenly somebody came into the operating theatre and said, "David, you've got to go now because the hospital's is targeted and it's going to be blown up within a few minutes. So you've got to come now." I sort of stood there and thought, okay, shall I go or shall I stay? And I looked at this little girl, and her guts were hanging out, and blood pressure was very low, and I looked at her, and she was anaesthetized, and the anaesthetist was putting on a ventilator. And I looked at him, and I thought, by this time there was only 2 of us in the operating theatre. So I looked at him and I said, "What do you think?" And he said, "Well, we should go." And I then turned around and said, "Well, I don't think I'm going to go because I'm not going to leave her." And it was a difficult decision to make, because I thought, so this hospital's going to be blown up with a bomb in a minute, and they're going to blow this little girl up, and I'm going to stand there, and I'm not going to be bullied by anybody. I'm not going to be forced out of an operating theatre. What would I think in 2 days' time when I'm lying in my hotel bedroom, lying there thinking, what did I do? I walked out on her. Yeah, I walked out. What would I do for the rest of my life thinking like that? So I didn't, and I stayed. And we operated upon her, and she did very well. And she then, went on to become, and still now, a lovely little girl. And so, to me, that was, like the best thing.
And they didn't blow up the hospital.
And they didn't blow up the hospital. It was, but everybody walked out. Everybody rushed out, because that was what was going to happen. And then you think to yourself, okay, I've got 2 little ladies. I've got 1 beautiful woman. And if I was in that same situation again, what would I do? And I don't know. I don't know what I would do. I don't know. I don't know. And how, I will find myself in that situation, because I do still go to war zones. And you may think, well, that's very, very irresponsible about leaving your wife and leaving your children and going to a war zone. Why would you do that? And then the other reason I come back to, say, well, it is part of the foundation, and Ellie is the chief executive of the foundation, so she wants me to come here. But that's not really true. My heart, my heart is still in there. It's still very much in there, and there's nothing I can do about it. And I think that Ellie realized that there's nothing she can do about it, and there's nothing I can do about it. But would I leave a little girl knowing that I was going to get blown up in that moment of time? I think I know the answer, but I'm not going to say it.
Nicola, can I have one more question?
You may.
So I think this has been reflected in the chat, actually, and it's something I alluded to earlier. And I think a lot of us are quite troubled by it. So like you, many of us were shocked by what happened in Ukraine, and we heard a lot about it on the news, and a lot of people have responded, and look at the people who've opened up their homes in the UK. Then you also think about what happened in Aleppo and the war in Yemen and parts of the world which haven't had quite so much attention as here, and where some people might have been in even worse positions. So certainly if you think about the bunker busting bombs in Aleppo. And I wondered what you felt about it. It's very hard to feel you should ration your sympathy, or how do you apportion it equally? Everybody's tragedy is their own. All wars are awful. But I just wondered if this was something which you had thought about too.
Yes, I have. I mean, all wars are awful. All wars are terrible. And there's no doubt about it that, you know, that every time I go somewhere, it's terrible. It's awful. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to alleviate the suffering that people are getting by somehow passing some knowledge on and leaving that legacy of training. But I think Ukraine is slightly different to the other countries, because Ukraine is affecting the world, really. And you know, look at the grain from Ukraine, which is now affecting Africa. Look at all those issues, and you know, it's closer to home. And you know, why should another man, which you know, in the Yemen, the same thing happens. You know, the other regime, the Al-Houthi regime are fighting the government. You know, why should they fight the government? You know, and why is it such that the poor civilian populations are in between? But this one is slightly different, I have a suspicion, because this one is about a man who is trying to take over a country and trying to invade a country on Europe's doorstep. And this man needs to be stopped. I'm sorry to say, but he needs to be stopped, because he will go on and invade other countries, and he has different ideas to what we rational people think about. And you know, it's not just a Yemeni isolated problem. It's not just a Syrian isolated problem. This is a world problem, and that's the slight difference in Ukraine, I think.
Mm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David and Bridget. We have reached 7:45. I'm sure we could have listened to you for many hours longer, David, but I'm sure you have some work that will be claiming your attention very soon. So I said when I introduced you both that I knew this was going to be an absolutely fascinating conversation, and it certainly was. It has ranged so wide, and I think that everyone who's received advice from you this evening will be very grateful for that. And thank you too for your frankness in describing the impact of this work on you and on your family. There are many comments in the chat. If you can't see them coming in now, I'll make sure that you receive a copy of them. There is an absolutely overwhelming sense of gratitude for what you're doing, and also a very strong desire that you should stay safe and continue your work and your incredible campaigning. I will just quote one of the comments I saw as I was glancing down it, that you are an inspiration to humanity, and that's certainly not overstating it. I think we would all endorse that. Having heard David and Bridget speak, I'm sure that many of you would like to continue supporting David's work, and do please follow the link in our chat and in the Zoom, in the message that you received from BEARR. And as I say, we are dividing all donations equally between BEARR, Ukraine Appeal, and the David Nott Foundation. So there we are, we've come to an end. Thank you again, and good night. Wish you all a very good evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.